Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. Got a really fun and interesting guest today. Somebody that I've been wanting to talk to for quite a while. And we're just kind of chuckling beforehand, realizing that we've never actually talked to each other, even though we're both really familiar with each other's work. But have Austin Tennell from Building Culture here with me today. Austin, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. I don't know how we've avoided each other this long, and I'm sure we've been at the same conferences together at times. So it's good to be talking.
I'm sure we have. I know that I've even like seen some of your work like in person. So there's that aspect as well, which is kind of funny. But anyway, it's good to chat. So Austin, if there's a whole lot that I want to talk about and that we can talk about here today. For those people in the audience who aren't really familiar with you, I became most interested following Austin's work because he's in what I would call as like the big family of people who I learned about doing sort of mass masonry, new construction. And I've had Clay Chapman on the show here previously, and we've talked about that. But Austin is younger than Clay. And he's taken things to a whole other level and different paths that are super interesting. Also is just a tremendous follow on social media with a lot of really interesting content. So that's kind of how I became aware of you. But Austin, I suppose before we get too far into that, I'm curious about how you got into this world of building and design to begin with.
I took a winding path into it for sure and ended up, on Clay Chapman's doorstep back in 2015. But I started my career as an accountant in 2011 because my dad had done that. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I'd never really thought to ask, what do I really want to do? Like what sounds cool? And so I just did it because it sounded practical. Realized that it was not for me. It just kind of laid on the couch on Sundays, wanting my life to end, kind of thing.
This feels like a scene from the movie Office Space or something.
Yeah, I mean, it really was bad. But what's interesting is right before I started that job, I had traveled Spain and Portugal for 3 months just on my own backpacking. I just graduated from college, had saved some money, had a job lined up, so I was like, I'll go blow whatever it was at the time. And it was in that moment, because I grew up in the suburbs of Houston, but it was walking, you're kind of taught growing up that we live at the pinnacle of all human civilization in, 21st century America. And a lot of things are amazing. We've got iPhones in our pockets. We got hot water. We got laptops, amazing things. And then you go walk around Spain and Portugal, these places built 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and you're going, this is utterly incredible. I didn't know anything about architecture, didn't know anything about urbanism, but I would really say that was the first. It was almost like helped me open my eyes to like this world I'd never seen before. So when I'm sitting under these fluorescent lights at KPMG, I'm just like, this can't be all the world has to offer. There's got to be more. I need to go exploring. So I ended up quitting, went off to Panama, ended up joining the Peace Corps, spent 2 years in Uganda. But it was during those travels when I was in Panama, this really 1 week overlap in 2013. Clay Chapman happened to be down in Panama for 1 week or for a couple of days. And that's where I met him. And then 2.5 years later, I called him up when I got back to the US and said, hey, I'm convinced this is what I wanted to do. I've been reading about new urbanism. I read Suburbanation in 2013. It kind of opened my eyes to, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense to me. And then I wanted to, kind of get into development because I understood that the developer pushes, really does a lot of the stuff, but I didn't want to be a spreadsheet developer. I really wanted to learn how to do. And so I called Clay and ended up in the Oklahoma, apprenticing for him for 2 years, my late 20s, $12 an hour, and had just gotten married with a 5-week engagement. So, and now we're 10 years later.
How about that? What the heck was he doing in Panama that you had this like serendipitous meeting?
There was this company called Kaluyala that was trying to build a sustainable town in the jungle, and I was interning there, and he happened to be there like on a consulting thing. The guy that started it had just found Clay. Happened to we didn't even talk that much,
Huh.
but he just stuck out in my mind. He's a pretty unique character, right?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
And
Yeah,
build some just unbelievable things.
yeah. So, what was that like then, sort of doing this gig in Oklahoma, like, really taking a leap of faith to go work with him for, a period of time?
Well, it was very hard, and that's something I don't like. Think about or necessarily talk about too often, but it is very hard. Like I was kind of on this professional trajectory, and then it's like I'm going to interrupt all of that.
Mm,
I'm in 27, 28, just gotten married, we just got back from the Peace Corps, had no money.
mhm.
I move out there making $12 an hour. We're laying brick in the hot sun or in the cold, or putting on roofs or digging foundations, and everyone's like, oh, it must be so amazing to lay brick. And you're like, there's some magic moments, but it's also really hard work.
Mhm,
And there's discomfort, and then my wife was cleaning houses to help us kind of
mm,
survive for a little bit, so there was a lot of sacrifice that went into it, not just on my part but on my wife's part. At the same time, I wouldn't trade it for the world. Like,
mm.
there is no better way to learn. I don't know if there was a better person in the world to learn from than Clay Chapman. Like, 'cause he's
Yeah,
been building stuff since he was like 17 years old, and a really just interesting, holistic, artistic, practical experience, hands-on thinker and doer.
yeah. So, I mean, how cool, is your wife that she just, like, ran along with all this too and went along with the plan?
Looking back, I honestly can't believe it. I'm like, honey, I did not appreciate you enough then, and my goodness, I love you. But we met in the Peace Corps, actually, so she
Uh-huh.
had that bug of adventure
Sure.
in her. But I think the scariest thing is not just the money. It's like you don't know what's going to happen next when you go off on these kind of like try something different. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's on the other side of it, and so there's in the middle of all the difficulty, it's also kind of like the uncertainty of it too is very disconcerting, especially when you see your friends.
Mhm.
They're moving up in management, making more money, and we're going like, oh my god, we're
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So Clay has famously then been trying to revive this kind of lost art of traditional masonry construction in Oklahoma, and anybody who's seen the work that he's done over the years, it's obviously gorgeous stuff. It really resonates with a lot of people. I've kind of joked that conference sessions that I've been in, like he's the guy that everybody wants to like talk to and see his buildings because they're just so unique, and we just don't see work like that anymore. What was it like for you to experience doing that? Because I'm not sure, like, what was your mindset going into that? Thought like you were just going to kind of learn how to do what he was doing, and then maybe you would do it, maybe you wouldn't. How do you? Because that's such a radical departure.
it is, and it was a lot unfolded, and I discovered a lot because I grew up kind of like a jock, played football, went and played D3 football in college, not like
Mhm,
D1 or anything like that. But I'd never thought of myself as artistic. So when I went to work for Clay, it was like, I'm going to learn how to build, kind of more like craftsman mindset a little bit. And then, I don't know, try to maybe figure out how to start a business after, I
mhm.
guess. Like, I didn't really know. I didn't really have a
Yeah.
plan. Here's what happens after the apprenticeship. And it was actually during the apprenticeship pretty early on, I was starting to freak out a little bit and being like, what am I going to do after this? Like, I'm going to have this weird skill of like knowing how to lay brick. And I had random people being like, hey, can you come lay this little wall for me? Like in off hours. I'm like, that's not going to help me. I
Yeah.
don't want to do that, And so actually that was my impetus to teach myself design. So I'm kind of self-taught in design in the sense, but at the same time, I say self-taught, but it was while I was working with Clay, building things he designs. I'm
Mhm.
showing him SketchUp models. I learned SketchUp, and
Mm.
really, I'm just trying to design things that I could understand how to build. And I knew so little about building. All my original buildings were super simple. They were rectangles. They,
Hmm.
copied some of the language that Clay was using. Well, if you're going to build an arch, it's, certain kind of rules of thumb if you're going to build these kind of natural materials. And then before I knew it, I was like, this actually looks pretty good. I
Yeah.
mean, it took me a long time to get there. And then now my design, and I compare this to, and I talked with Clay about this at the time, but when you're learning to play an instrument, it's you learn the notes, and then you learn to play cover songs of other people's music,
Right.
and then you start adding your own flair to it. And before you know it, you're composing your own music. So at the time, in my first projects, you see a lot of overlap with clay. I've got these really steep roofs on it, and I don't mean they look exactly like clay. It looked like mine, but at the same time, it was borrowing a lot in that language. But then over time, I've developed my own sense of taste too, and it's still evolving, which is really fun.
Mhm.
And yeah.
So how does somebody teach themselves design? I'm an architect, and I want to have you confront the architecture cabal here and say, Austin, you really need to go to architecture school for 6 years, and then have a 3-year internship after that, and then after that you can be properly licensed and as an architect. And then you're really just at the beginning, because the truth is you don't know shit when you're at that point. So how does somebody teach themselves design without going through all that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there's a whole thing on just like a conversation, sidebar conversation of just what it means to be an expert in something.
Yeah,
Um,
obviously
but
I'm being facetious, but
right.
anyway.
So one, SketchUp is a really easy
Yeah.
system because you are designing in 3D, and I would say it's kind of the closest thing to drawing by hand, but on a computer, but without like pencil drawing on the computer.
Yeah.
So there's one, you're designing in 3D, so people that aren't kind of like accustomed to things, you can literally understand it.
Mhm.
So then I'm learning how to build, and what I was doing is I was like drawing things that we were building in details to like understand how it got together. So it actually helped me start thinking about how to problem solve like actual construction, because I would be designing, but I could really only design things that I knew how to build because no one had taught me design. So I was like thinking through how to build something and designing it at the same time. But ultimately, I was looking at people. It's like, what style were you doing? How did you learn how to, design? It was like, I just looked at pictures I found beautiful. I just had Pinterest. And it's not like I was copying a building. You just, you've got Instagram and Pinterest, and you travel and you're like, these buildings are really beautiful. What makes them beautiful? I don't, there's a lot of commonalities there, but it was really looking at precedent.
Mhm.
And then frankly a lot of time. Like, this wasn't just like, oh, let me just teach myself design. It was a lot of, frankly, time, and I had a ridiculous amount of time into my first design of a
Mhm.
home. But it comes from the practicality and the hands-on stuff, and those being married together, I think, is, and then a lot of desperation
Yeah.
of like, what am I going to do after this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the cool thing is that there's actually so many more tools and resources out there now that are easy for somebody to latch onto to learn about design concepts and design tools. And obviously, there's hundreds of years of really great books that somebody can dive into, but now with YouTube and everything else, there's really cool opportunities for people to learn as
Yeah.
well.
and
Go
and I
ahead.
will say, like, one thing, Matt Hayes, he's a Notre Dame architect. He came to work with me 3 years ago,
Hmm.
and something that's been interesting, because I guess you could say I have a very like, I have not been trained, and
Hmm.
like, and especially in like really refined details, or like classical. I don't know how to like do a the right Corinthian column or something like that. Um, but it's been really interesting to see kind of Matt's more formal education with my more informal education, and the melding of those two is
Hmm.
actually pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I bet. I
Because
bet.
it's not that that's not valuable, like the formal education. Of course, that's Notre Dame, which is kind of a different education to begin with,
Yeah.
in a very good way, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of one of the better ones, and it's a weird part of how specialized everything is nowadays. That you have architecture schools that are very, very steeped in like theory and then certain ideological approaches to design, uh, often divorced from how things are built. And then you have people who are taught to build and learn to build, but often aren't really taught anything about design. So there's kind of a weird breakdown
And
there.
then the developers who are taught how to put, the bank
Yeah.
financing together, and the engineers how to
Yeah.
keep the building standing up, and no one knows what the other
Yeah.
person does.
Yeah, it's I mean, we all need each other in a certain sense, but it's weird that, people aren't better cross-trained. So what was your first step then after the apprenticeship? What was the first thing you decided to take on, or you were able to take on right
Way
away?
too big of a project. I had moved into we were living in this tiny little house in Eufaula because we couldn't afford Carlton Landing at the time. Found a little rental apartment. Someone was building an ADU out back, and my wife found the people that were building it, and we said, "Can we move in here?" And they we couldn't really afford it, but they ended up feeling bad for us and said, if you take care of the lawn, we'll let you pay, X amount, whatever you can afford.
Hmm. There you go.
And turns out those people were fairly wealthy people, and hadn't come from wealth, but they had people invest in them, and they sold a business. And so that they ended up being an initial investor and said, like, we want to help you start a business.
Hmm.
And I was stupid enough to, rather than like pitch a house, I pitched an entire pocket neighborhood of
Hmm.
like the Bend, which ended up being the Bend.
Hmm.
So it was 6 houses. And so when they said yes, it was exhilarating. And then I was like, oh my gosh, now I have to figure out how to do all of this.
That's fantastic. So how did you then how do you start out when you haven't designed anything like on your own, your first thing and it's 6 houses? How do you go about that?
Well, it's very stressful. And one, I've had a lot of little gifts along the way, whether it was meeting Clay and learning from him, and then meeting this investor, which was really serendipitous, and he ended up kind of like pairing me with another builder. He invested in us, and I was very like, hey, I want to keep building culture its own thing, it's its own brand. He said, that's great, but y'all can share resources. And two of the houses ended up being stick frame houses that basically my partner at the time did. So
Hmm.
I did 4 houses, he did two, and he was a more experienced builder than me. And so I could go to him with basic questions and things like that. So it really worked out. I kind of have had little guardrails as I've gone on in my career that have been really, really helpful. And of course, you've got engineers, and your lumber package gets engineered and things like that. So there's lots of guardrails out there, but in some ways I would also just say it was really hard and really stressful, and I've worked a lot for many years, like a lot long hours for many years, because you learn, gosh, a lot of things can construction is just dealing with things going wrong anyway.
Yeah.
And when you're new to it and you don't know all the things that can go wrong, you're
Yeah.
it's
So
tough.
when you started with your company, why did you choose the name Building Culture? Where did that come from?
So my sister actually came up with the name because I'd been thinking forever about it. And the moment she said it, she texted to me. I was like, I knew that was it, because it was captured everything I wanted, and had this double meaning of the
Mhm.
building culture, the construction culture, but also building culture. Because I really believe, and actually I believe even more now than I did before, we're really up against kind of like two different things. We've got all this stuff about architecture and engineering developers, and the broken zoning codes, and the building codes, and all these incentives that are out of whack. And yes, we need to fix all of those things. But that's only 50% of the equation. The other 50% of the equation is culture, is values, is people, and how they think, and what they want. And so, like, I don't think, if we really want to see like an architectural revolution in this country, it's about speaking to hearts and minds as
Mhm.
much as it's about speaking to the technicalities and things like that, and why price per foot is not the end all be all metric, when it's like lifestyle. What is your everyday life like? In America, we want to make everything about the big moments, that like 1 week vacation once a year, or the holiday, and like that, all of that life's meaning is supposed to be like injected within these few big moments. It's like, that's not what life is, and that's not where meaning comes from. It comes from every day. It comes from the small interactions, the small beauties, the everyday things and experience. That's really where, like, you know fulfillment and meaning and purpose come from. And I think the new urbanists have been talking about that in a lot of ways. And anyway, well, you asked me about how the name came about, so I'm kind of going off on a tangent
No,
here,
that's
but
fine.
really that's the double meaning of it.
So I want to come back to the bend in a minute in the project, but what you're talking about there, kind of, it's fascinating because I have this kind of half written like Twitter thread or whatever that I haven't posted at all yet. But I was thinking a lot about the difference between sort of low tech and high tech solutions to a lot of the things that we have identified as problems in whether our cities or towns or American society or whatever else. And it's fascinating because you're in a world where I think most people would describe what you're doing as sort of a low tech, traditional approach to building buildings and building community, something that's much closer to things that we've done for thousands of years. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the high tech, there's the Silicon Valley world, which has tons and tons of money that they throw at problems, and have in our world, one of the things they've consistently thrown money at for the last 2 decades is like 3D printing, as like, well, this really the solution for housing and everything is to 3D print houses and do it at scale, and be able to basically mass produce better and cheaper houses. And that dichotomy is really fascinating to me, how there's just like two vastly different thought processes about how to approach these problems. I wonder if you want to kind of about that a little bit.
I love this theme, actually, like this conversation here. There's this new term I've started to use that I'm starting to introduce, but cutting edge old tech. So like that's what we're about. It building culture is cutting edge old tech. Um, so first, I really like how Steve Jobs framed, I guess, like when they were working on Apple at the beginning. It's you start with the user experience and then you back
Mm,
into the hardware.
yeah.
And you don't start with engineering. You really start with the user experience and then figure out what you need to build from there to provide that experience. Um, in terms of technology, like sometimes technology can turn into like technology for technology's sake. Like let's do
Right.
touch faucets and talking fridges and other things. And I'm not necessarily denigrating those things as saying they should never happen. I don't want them in my house. And I'm kind of going like, what is the real value to them? At the same time, I'm not a Luddite, where it's like, oh, let's just do everything how it used to be done. Like, hey, we've got technology and let's use this. So I'm actually, and I think I'm a little bit controversial here because I don't fit quite in the traditionalist mindset of it because I'm not kind of
Hmm.
purist enough there. But I'm like, heck yeah, let's use robots to cut our stone and
Hmm.
create all these mass stone buildings again that are too expensive to do because we can't chisel by hand. And it's not about taking away or like let's be ruled by robots. It's like let's use technology in service of humans and humanity and the things that we want to do. And so there's a guy, Monumental Labs in New York, who's got these robots he's starting with art. And of course, people are very upset about this that robots are doing art. But what's his name? Not Coleman Hughes. Samuel Hughes.
Hmm.
He wrote an article recently about how talking about like precast stone and carving and stuff like that, and how like these guys that were really good at sculpting, they didn't like come and sculpt from the beginning from a block of stone. They would create a little something out of plaster. They would have a bunch of other people come and like get the stone really close to what it was going to be, and then they'd come in and like finish it up. I'm like, what is the difference between that and a robot doing the same thing, getting to that, and then
Right.
still requiring the human hand to finish it and doing the things that robots can't do? And is it really that exciting to chisel the same corbel detail over and over and over again for an entire lifetime? Now, I'm not
Hmm.
saying it's bad to do that. I'm just saying I think we can harness technology at the same time. Like 3D printing houses, like some of it just gets, I think, simplicity. Like we really shoot ourselves in the foot where we have a highly complex, highly vulnerable building system, and then we pack it with really expensive stuff. And like from
Yeah.
a building, houses aren't manufactured in a warehouse in a highly controlled environment like a car or a vehicle is. This is out in the field over a year, 9 months, 12 months, hundreds of people involved, rain or shine, all this stuff going on. And then our solutions, being stick frame is what I mean is to do a well detailed stick frame house. It's actually pretty complex. And if you do it well, it actually can last a really long time, but it's highly complex. And then the double whammy is that it's also highly vulnerable because we're using materials that are susceptible to termites, to rot, to water, to mold, to fire. And water is going to get in. And so it is going to damage these materials. And so part of me is going like, let's dumb down our buildings a little bit and do a simpler building that's more resilient and durable and less vulnerable.
Yeah. So, and that leads you to masonry construction. How do you compare like the masonry you do versus what you've seen, or maybe I don't know how much you've seen of like the 3D printed sort of masonry, or 1-story construction houses.
I've seen like 3D printed concrete houses where the things
Yeah.
out they're kind of going in the loop. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know enough about that. I have a feeling that's not going to end up being like some great solution or something. Um, Very open to prefabricated things, larger masonry units, pre-insulated masonry units.
Mhm.
Um, but I just haven't seen something that I'm like, oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
a great solution.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think, our mutual friend John Anderson kind of criticized a lot of those, talking about that you have this really expensive equipment that basically is replacing like a two-man crew that can build the same wall in 3 days. Uh,
Right. It's really not that efficient,
yeah,
I would agree with that.
yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting world. I think I'm old enough to remember that people have been talking about prefab elements for housing for like basically my whole life, for 40 50 years or more. And we've seen certain elements come into play, but really very, shockingly little of it compared to what people thought would happen. And there's so much of that I think gets to what you talked about, that there's an awful lot of this that just has to happen in the field, and it's really hard to control every variable, especially if you are building like in a city, in a tight context, and not like a house out in the country. Things still have to happen in the field,
Right, they
no
do.
matter what. And
And I mean, ultimately, what people are trying to get to is lower cost housing. I mean,
yeah,
that's the point of the prefab and stuff. And so it's like, what are all the reasons housing is expensive? And there's a lot of reasons housing are expensive because of every 3 years, new rules come out that literally make housing more expensive.
yeah,
We got new technologies that are constantly making housing more expensive. HVAC is increasingly expensive, things like that. Plumbing gets more expensive. I would love to see lower cost materials for sure. Like if you could um, manufacture brick at half the cost, that would be a good thing in my mind.
yeah,
If you mechanize that and say you electrified the grid with actually sustainable energy or something that's very cheap energy, and then you're able to transport stuff cheaper and simplify buildings. You can and ultimately too, though, people want housing to be cheap, but new housing's never been cheap.
right.
Like new housing's always been expensive, and so we had this idea of, oh, how dare that developer build not affordable housing? And it's like there
Mhm.
is no such thing as new construction affordable housing that's not subsidized.
Yeah,
It's impossible to build quote unquote affordable housing, as our John says, is
yeah,
affordable housing is old housing, and so part of the thing is we just need more housing,
yeah,
and rather than putting it all on the building.
yeah, no doubt. People are kind of funny about how they don't understand some of the basic economics of all that. Yeah. Like the fact that like supply and demand is still a thing. I mean, who would guess? Um,
It's unbelievable.
get getting back to the Bend, then how talk about your experience of building those homes, and then sort of the end user reaction at the end of all that, and buyers and people who moved into those homes.
Yes, I'll tell you a little bit about like both a great success and a failure at the same time. I don't think I've really talked about this out loud before, but we were building this on spec. And at the time in Carlton Landing, for those listening, I mean, this is a resort community in Oklahoma, same designers as Seaside. But when I first moved out there was like 42 houses
Hmm.
or something like that. Anyway, by the time I'm building the Bend, there were somewhere around close to 200 houses. And the demand was high. There was not enough lots. It was like builders were trying to like fight for lots. So we were building this speculatively, 6 homes. It was like, I don't know, $3.2 million project at the time, or 3.8, I can't remember. um and you kind of have to build the whole thing for it to work. So the first home, I think I was building simultaneously, but like the very first time I was building, like literally my first house, it was pre-sold, under contract, like 3 months before completion, with a full cash offer. And so we were like, fantastic, this is going great. The second house got a contract on it well before completion. So then we were like, yeah, we're going to finish the rest, and even need to go and buy a couple more lots for so we have stuff to do when we're finishing. And this is a big deal, by the way, to have cash offers on things that
Oh
are a
yeah.
little bit more expensive because of comps and all that you're aware of. But a bank comes in and tells you, well, the comps in the area, the other houses are only worth X amount, so your house is only worth X amount, so we'll only learn X amount of money. And I've learned that lesson the hard way multiple times. Um, but in terms of this development, so it was going really well and turned out to be just a beautiful development. The people that live there love it. The people Carlton Landing, love it. You get people taking pictures in front of the moon gate. It was really great for my career starting off. So I'd say, like, in one sense, a lot of success, awesome, although it was, hard won too, a lot of pain points of just learning lots of little things along the way. But then secondly, it was kind of a failure because after that second house had a contract under it, Carlton Landing, the market in Carlton Landing, which is kind of this little micro economy because it's a resort community,
Hmm.
tanked. Ended up being 42 houses on the market out of 200 total.
Wow.
So basically 25% of the houses on the market. And it's like, no matter how great your house is, you're not going to make money selling into a market like that. So we ended up kind of like pausing construction, and we ended up, and then you're paying interest and bleeding interest, and then you eventually sell them, and you don't sell them for what you want. And at least we kind of got out under it, kind of lived to see another day kind of thing. But it was also a pretty painful lesson. And the reason I'm kind of bringing it up is the lesson that I learned is, if we're going to build spec again, don't ever be forced to sell it, because both of those houses, actually several of the houses, have resold. I think I sold the last one for like $505,000 and one was $495,000. They've resold for $837,000 and something respectively, just
Mm-hmm.
3 years later.
Yeah.
And so if I had had the wherewithal and understood, like, you know what, the market's tanked, there's nothing I can do about that right now, I'm going to hold on to these houses and rent them out for 2 years, whatever, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. And it might not be like super cash flow positive because they weren't really intended to be rental properties, and maybe they're
Mhm.
slightly negative. But literally, if I'd done that, I would have come out like $1 million ahead. Then, which is just kind of crazy to think about. So, that's really informed how I think about this Townsend project where we're doing this infill. We're breaking it into
Mhm.
phases. And it's like each phase, it's like, we're not moving on to the next phase until this phase is sold. And by the way, if things get really bad, we're just going to hold on to it, never sell into like the bad market and lose the money. It's
Yeah.
like, wait until it recovers and then sell.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of friends of ours who've learned similar lessons. And for sale housing is hard. It's tricky. It's so much. There's so much about that's like timing, and you can be really smart and do great homes, but if you have bad timing, it can be really really tough. Or you can have like the crappiest homes, but if you have good timing, you can do very well. It's a funny game. So where do you go then after the bend? What happens next for you?
We started doing like did a pretty big like tower house. People had seen what we did at the bend and were like, hey, we want to build this lakefront property, and it was kind of an opportunity to, I guess you could say, pioneer a little bit, innovate a little bit more on a bigger structure. And so I went and found the most conservative like structural engineer in the state with a stellar reputation, and convinced them to engineer the project and do
Hmm.
it with GFRP rebar, so glass fiber reinforced polymer,
Hmm.
not steel, so that we weren't putting steel into the building, which rusts and expands and will blow out the masonry. And at the time, it was actually pretty new. Now, even like local places are starting to stock GFRP.
Hmm.
But we ended up designing that whole thing with GFRP rebar and building that. Did a few other things in Carlton Landing, and then ultimately moved to Oklahoma City in 2020, which was kind of what I had been eyeing to do because I really
Mhm.
wanted to build a business. But it was great to start in Carlton Landing where I had relationships, and then moved to Oklahoma City in 2020.
So why did you choose Oklahoma City?
because because we knew like a handful of people. My wife's from Pittsburgh, I'm from Houston. We know no one here. We didn't really have much money, so it was kind of like move somewhere. And it was like Tulsa or Oklahoma City, and we actually
Uh-huh.
liked Tulsa better. But we were
Yeah.
like, we know a few people in Oklahoma City, so we moved to
Yeah.
Oklahoma City. And part of it was Blair Humphrey had kind of invited me to build in Wheeler District because we had a relationship from Carlton Landing. And so I was like, all right, well, I kind of got my next thing I can do. And the only thing other I'll tell you about that is like I kind of, we thought Oklahoma City was going to be temporary. Like, okay, we're going to be in Oklahoma City for 2 or 3 years and then move on, um, and go to Austin or Nashville or something where it's really happening.
Hmm.
And after being in Oklahoma City for a little while, we realized it's a great place to live, great place to raise a family, but also I feel like it's at the right time where we're catching it 25 years before Austin became Austin or
Mm.
Dallas or Nashville or whatever, Phoenix, and really get to shape what happens because it's growing. It's the 20th largest city in the US, but it's not explosive yet. It hasn't seen that growth, but it's increasing. It's growing fast. And I'm like, man, we can really like shape what happens and hopefully make it have a different trajectory than the Texas cities, which, I'm
Yeah.
from Houston, so I'm not anti-Texas, but I'm so sad with how they've developed. I just drove from Oklahoma City to Austin last week, and it was the most horrific drive you could possibly imagine. It's 2.5 hours out of Oklahoma, and which there's just not a whole lot. It's a pretty
Mhm.
small state, 4 million people in the whole state.
Mhm.
So, and then you hit the outskirts of Fort Worth, and then for 4 hours, it's awful traffic, awful highways with literally the same exit sign with the same stores for 4 hours. It just anywhere inhuman
Yeah.
USA. It really is. It's really terrible. And I hope that in Oklahoma we can take a different path. There's no local culture, no local identity. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, it's incredible on the one hand how much the Dallas Fort Worth area has grown and boomed. But on the other hand, I would say the majority of it is pretty typical suburban development that we've seen for 70 years or so.
Right.
Um, so I actually just had your mayor on of Oklahoma City not too long ago. Interesting guy,
Oh my
and
gosh, I missed that. I didn't even know that. That's
yeah,
awesome.
I'm really interested in Oklahoma City, and this is part of why I ask. Because I think you hit on some things that are uh, seem really prescient and interesting for a lot of people who are looking to kind of make their way. One, it's a city that is growing and growing. It's not a boom town potentially like Nashville, but it's growing a lot, um, and it's still an affordable market. It has a diverse enough economy now, much more so than it used to, that there's more going on. So it's a little better insulated from sort of economic shocks than it probably was 30 or 40 years ago. But I would tell you my observation from going down there. I've been down there a few times in the last 3 or 4 years, and the opportunity for people who want to do kind of cool urban stuff, it just seems off the charts. There's immense opportunity for infill work all over the city. The downtown has clearly bottomed out and is really getting better. But there's a lot of land like within easy distance of the center of the city that is developable. I wonder if did that kind of factor into your thinking too when you're thinking about the kind of projects you want to do?
Oh, absolutely. It's like all this land right around like downtown and stuff. You're like, what? This hasn't been developed. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
uh, so yeah, tons of opportunity. And I agree with you. There's a lot of interesting people. I mean, it's a small group, I guess you could say, but there's a lot of interesting projects about to come out of the ground that, I mean,
mhm,
in 10 years or less, Oklahoma City is going to have some pretty extraordinary projects. I mean, Wheeler is already just a
yeah,
fantastic
yeah,
example because it's literally a stone's throw from downtown.
yeah,
And they've done the real mixed use things. They've got the single family detached houses, yes, but they've also got row housing going and they've got live work units. They've got office space and restaurant and brewery and a gym that's like used. And
mm,
then they've got a multifamily building going in and they're really, walking the talk there. It's an extraordinary development.
yeah, yeah. It's one of the better urban infill things that people don't really know about outside of kind of certain circles.
Yeah, and it's
Uh,
still small. I can't wait
yeah,
like 10 years down the road when it's really built out some more. I mean, it's just going to be awesome.
yeah. So I've seen some renderings that you've shared of the new project that you're looking at, which look pretty incredible. And why don't you talk a little bit about how things have evolved and what you're working on now?
Yeah, that project is very exciting. It's kind of the culmination of a decade, is what I would say.
Yeah.
Of what I've been working towards. So the project's called the Townsend, and it's only about an acre infill. And this is in Edmond, so it's kind of like the Decatur to Georgia. It's part of the
Mhm.
Oklahoma City metro. Edmond is just a suburb, 20 minutes north, and it's got its own little downtown, and it's just started revitalizing. So we've got an acre. We're putting 24 cell townhomes, and then about 8,700 square feet of for lease uh, boutique office and co-working space. And there's a lot of things that have happened in this because, well, one, there's the entitlement phase, and that's taken us, 18 months
Oh,
to
really?
do. Even in Oklahoma, it's
Wow.
very difficult to do these things. We had to
What
work through a lot of problems.
what accounted for that? I'm surprised by that length of time. What accounted for it taking so long?
Working through city and staff comments
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
resubmitting and getting new comments and resubmitting. People aren't used to this type of development.
Yeah.
All the rules and regulations and experience is around suburban sprawl. So what we were doing and are doing is tough,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and so there's just a lot of things to work through. Um, the idea of it, and I think you'll definitely really get this, but it's like part of the thesis of this is This is not an affordable housing project. This is going to
Hmm.
be pretty nice. And we have interest in doing more affordable things too. This is just not that. But there's all these, in Oklahoma, it's pretty typical for people to live in 4,000 square foot houses,
Hmm.
4,500 square foot houses. But
No,
when people hit their,
with no basements typically.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and
yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Same with Texas and other Midwest cities. And so if you talk about people and this, not that we're only going after this demographic, but I've been talking to a lot of people that hit their 50s, their kids move out of their house, they're going, what do I do with this 4,500 square feet anymore? I don't want this half acre. I want something convenient. I want something smaller and low maintenance and easy to maintain, but I want it to be really nice. I've got some money, like I just want it to be nice, but the moment you go small, it all becomes builder grade. So it's this idea of like building smaller but better. So on the townhouses and and also, I mean, these people, they'll start looking at urban environments, but then it's like, what are the options in urban environments? It's multifamily apartments and condo buildings, and that's a really giant jump from single family detached house on a big lot to like structure parking and an elevator.
Yeah.
And so what we're really trying to do with this neighborhood is an urban neighborhood. So it's a coherent neighborhood with a coherent identity. You walk out of your townhouse into a courtyard and gardens, and then you can walk out onto the urban street. And so that's a very different thing than just putting like a building on a street in an urban environment. I'm not saying, that works sometimes too. Um, so I've had to raise money for that, which was my first time, really raising money, putting a syndication
Mhm.
together. Um, Thankfully had a partner in this that brought the land and has helped really kind of coach on how to do the syndication and set things up. And then it was
Mhm.
kind of like up to me to go raise money. And then one other thing really evolved with this is thinking about how the investment was going to work. And I think this is something key to infill projects and new urbanism in general that could be utilized more and more. I got on Twitter a year and a half ago. I hadn't really been on Twitter before.
Mhm.
Ran across Moses Kagan and just the real estate
Mhm.
community
Yeah.
there. And there's not a lot of these people aren't necessarily new urbanists, but a lot of them are doing great work or just
Mhm.
really smart people are in real estate. And he had this philosophy and he's got it pinned on his social profile. It's something about we do what wealthy families have been doing for generations. We buy quality real estate in supply constrained environments. We steward it well and we leverage it conservatively and we hold indefinitely.
Yeah.
And, as I was learning about real estate, it's like, you got to have a 5 to 7 year exit. You got to hit a
Yeah.
20% IRR, blah, 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 blah. And it makes it really hard because it is kind of actually extractionist in many circumstances. And walkable urbanism, as we know, does create the most value, but it takes time for that value to be fully realized. And
Mhm.
frankly, the more that a downtown transforms, the more supply that comes online. In a lot of ways, the demand goes up too because it becomes more desirable
Yeah.
to begin with, and then it's very hard to repeat. It's very hard to do. So I went back to investors, and said like, "Hey, what do you guys think about holding the commercial piece long term?"
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. And so now we're going to sell off the townhomes, hold the commercial long term, and we're actually going to manage that commercial as building culture and move our offices in there and really combining hardware plus software. And that's I think what I'm most excited about this project now is combining the hardware and software. It's not just building it and leaving. We're building it and moving in and hosting events and creating that culture over time.
Yeah. That's really smart. I think it kind of reminds me of something that Vince Graham used to say all the time, who was he, with his dad and his brothers, developed Ion in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. But Vince used to always say, when you're building community, like when you're building a real, authentic community, everything you do is additive. So if you add housing, if you add shops, the other thing, it's all additive. It increases the value to everybody else. But when you're building kind of typical suburbia, you're really building exclusivity, and everything that you add diminishes the value. Because when you're building for privacy and exclusivity, more people, more other things just basically means more hassle and more downside. So it's really like completely twisting your mind around to think about it differently. Um, so can you talk? Do you mind talking about like how much money did you have to raise to do this project?
Yeah. So in total, it's about a $27 million project.
Hmm.
Now, we only raised $3.5 million, but the reason is because we're breaking it into three phases, as I
Hmm.
talked about. Because the scars I have, that I've learned from. So it's not exactly this, but consider each phase about $9 million, and so then you're bringing $3.5 million of equity and $5.5 million of debt.
Yeah.
And so we can really protect investor capital. There's still risk involved with any development, but it's also like, hey, if we had to keep it for a little bit because the market tanked, next year there's a war in Ukraine, who knows,
Right.
um, we could hold on to it and rent it out for time. And they're coherent sections the way we've done it, so it's not like it feels like a half built project. It'll definitely be better if the whole thing's built, but that's really how we're managing our risk, because otherwise you're building $27 million at once, being like, I hope all of our
Hmm.
assumptions are right and that all of it can sell right at the same time for what we've asked. And that's a tough ask when you're doing something that is a bit pioneering,
Yeah.
and there's no doubt it is pioneering. It is new. There aren't comps. That's why it's so hard to do stuff like this, because it's hard to raise money on it. It's hard to get the bank financing on it. It's hard to do the
Mhm.
entitlements. All of it's difficult.
So if you're like a larger experienced developer like a Moses Kagan, raising $3.5 million is not probably a big deal. But how hard was that for you, never having raised that amount of money before?
Incredibly hard. Oh, so hard. It was, and am I asking for the first check for $100,000? You're kind of like, yeah, it's just very uncomfortable. And thankfully, like, I feel more comfortable with it now, and I've gotten better at it and more confident. But still, there's so much to learn. But I've also found it kind of fun and interesting. And this is, also kind of borrowing from Moses Kagan a little bit, but he's built, you know, a, a network on Twitter and through his newsletter. And he can literally kind of send out an email and be like, hey, I'm raising money for a deal, and have like $10 million raised in a couple. Now he's built a
Yeah.
career,
Yeah.
and, he's really built a lot of trust, and he's delivered for investors over time. And I want to do the same thing in a lot of ways. And the reason, what's so interesting about social media and Twitter, and this is new, this is not all, until the 2012 Jobs Act, none of this was possible legally anyway because of
Mhm.
the SEC. With the 2012 Job Act, you can do a 506C exemption, a Reg D 506C exemption, where I, as Austin, or you, as Kevin, can shout to the world and say, we're raising money for this project, we're raising this much money. But before, you couldn't do that. You had to have an existing relationship
Mm.
beforehand. You couldn't publicly solicit, is what it's called. So 2012 enabled you to publicly solicit. And then secondly, technology has really caught up, one, with just social media platforms in general, where you've kind of got a megaphone. And then two, investor management platforms like Appfolio, and there's multiple other Square Deal, or Juniper Square, where you can start managing some of these things at scale as an individual or as a small team. And so what I learned is, after spending 6 months raising in Oklahoma City, where I don't have a ton of relationships because I'm
Mhm.
I'm kind of new here, and
Right.
everyone here has been like in their 50s or 60s. They're like, they went to high school with half the people in the city. It's
Yeah.
just such a
Sure.
small group of people. So eventually what I did is I just posted on Twitter. I said, hey, we're doing this thing. And I couldn't believe the response that I got, because these people had been following building culture and me for 8-9 years, whatever it is, or some of them shorter than that. But some of them been like, I've been following you since your Carlton Landing days. I'd love to invest. And I was like, whoa, like, that's crazy. And I would get on the phone with them and talk, and you're not trying to sell something like, here's this is going to be the most money you've ever made. It's really more like, this is, if your number one priority is making money, you should probably do something else. Like, I'm going to protect your capital and all that, but this is not going to be like home run, double your money.
It's not Nvidia stock that's gonna
It's not Nvidia
triple
stock,
in a
right?
year or something. Yeah.
But that was right. That turned off certain people, but it also kept the people that are like, hey, we really want to invest in this. Yes, we want to make money. We want to hold this, but we really want to see projects like this happen. And so I realized social media could really be a platform for, frankly, new urbanists and developers to share, to connect with the people that actually share the values, because that's
Mhm.
what you're looking for as investors, that understand the risks, that can take those risks, but also share the values. And so that's what I've really learned now, and I'm learning and stepping into, and getting pretty excited about the possibilities there.
Yeah. That's really cool. That's a great lesson. Really worthy of sharing for a lot of people. I hadn't really considered that too much before, but that's an incredible opportunity. Can you talk a little bit about, like, so the project itself, from a design and building standpoint? Are there things that you're doing differently, that excite you about it, or ways that you're experimenting?
Yeah, there's a lot of experimentation. Of course, we're trying to balance it all, and
Yeah.
and the commercial piece that we're going to be holding kind of indefinitely, we're doing that out of structural masonry, and I'll come back to that in a second. The rest of it's probably going to be stick frame with brick veneer.
Hmm.
because we literally can't afford. It cost us 40% more to build today than it did 4 years ago,
Wow.
because of cost inflation in building, and that's every builder I talk to. And I during COVID in Oklahoma City, there's just when it costs 40% more. I mean, it's just so hard to afford stuff.
Yeah.
And then when you add that extra 10-15% for the structural masonry, that literally 10-15% is all the profit. You
Hmm.
can't sell it for that. So we'll probably end up trying to pre-sell things. We can get things to be structural masonry, great. But I'm kind of in the mindset of like, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. There's so many good things about this project. Structural masonry is inherently more expensive, but it's also more expensive because the industry hasn't innovated around it at all.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like keep going in the right direction. It's not like our kind of North Stars changed. It's just like it's the next evolution of it. So among the commercial buildings, what we're doing, um, we partnered with some really awesome engineers who are really interested in structural masonry, really figuring stuff out and being creative. So I think we're coming up with some pretty innovative engineering solutions. Over time, I'm hoping we will share, and be
Hmm.
like, hey, if you want to build structural masonry, here's the playbook of how to do it, and like literally how to get through the code and all of that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. We're insulating it. We're doing integral insulation. So rather than a
Hmm.
solid triple wyeth wall, we're doing a double wyeth wall, a 4-inch cavity, and then a single wyeth wall. So if you're going like, is that a veneer? You're like, actually, that is a veneer.
Hmm.
We're using, but our structure is still structural masonry, 8 inches of structural masonry. Then we're using semi-rigid mineral wool. So that's hydrophobic. It doesn't absorb water. It's inorganic, so it's not going to mold. And it's highly permeable, so it breathes. When you're doing masonry and you're insulating it, you really don't want to seal it off.
Hmm.
So you don't want to use closed cell spray foam or even open cell because that'll absorb water. So this mineral wool is kind of like the right type of material for that kind of works with the masonry. And then it's actually pretty great. I mean, Vitruvius talks about cavity walls. So that brick veneer, I'm an advocate for brick veneer even on stick frame because it's an amazing siding. So if you've got
Right.
the masonry structure and then you've got good insulation, you've got a brick veneer as your cladding, that's actually a really awesome wall system, I think.
Yeah. Are you doing that or that installation to hit like an energy code requirement?
Yes, we have to do it to hit energy code requirements
Yeah.
because we get some thermal massing, and obviously there's a mass wall clause in the IECC, but you still have to get now with this insulation. It actually is going to perform really well because you're getting the thermal massing, you're getting continuous insulation, and we're still doing geothermal on all of these because that way we don't have to have outside condensers because this is so dense. It's like where do you
Yeah.
put those? You could put them on the roof, but they would look pretty ugly in this development. One of the other things I'm excited about doing is it's not quite like Guastavino stairs. Well, it might be, but like we'll be doing these arch stairways. So we're going to be building like these exterior stairs on the commercial that are it's just an arch kind of
Yeah.
turned sideways with steps on it. So it'll be this really beautiful masonry staircases that I've been wanting to do for a long time.
That's really cool. So in order to do all of that, so talk a little bit about like how much of the construction piece of it now that you all have under your hat in your company, and how much of it do you have to go out to others for?
So we actually subcontract all of our work right now.
Oh
We've
wow.
got some punch, like we've got superintendents and like punch work where like handyman type stuff where we do internally. Ultimately, I would want to have our own masonry team. The problem is when you're building a business and you've got it's really hard to hire, but you need 8-10 people, and then you've got 8-10 people on payroll. And
Yeah.
like, how do you keep up with that? So for a while, I had just a single crew that we had worked with a lot, and that was great. But this was some years ago when I first moved to Oklahoma City in 2020. I just went and picked I say random crew, tried to find a good crew,
Yeah.
and then because I was like so worried about like what happens if something ever happens to this crew. And so it was kind of like a test case to challenge myself. And sure enough, we just built the dang thing. Like it took me more time, like on the job site, because I'm showing them more things. But the
Hmm.
thing is, it's not actually hard. There's just some know how. So if you take a good crew that's used to like quality masonry construction, and then you show them some nuances about the structural masonry and then have oversight, you can do it.
Hmm.
It is hard, but it's not hard if that, if
Yeah.
that
Sure.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating because what that kind of tells me is there's an opportunity to scale that type of work by just finding existing masonry crews in city. Find in any city you can find a good crew that you could, in fairly short order, you could teach them how to evolve it to do what you're doing.
Absolutely. And that's what's so exciting. It's not so specialized where you've got to go apprentice for two. Granted, if you do, like, great, that's going to help you. But my hope is that, especially after Townsend, I think this is kind of a different level. And of course, we've learned a lot. And then now I've got a better, a larger team. And I think there's going to be more documentation as we go too. I'm really hoping that after Townsend, and especially with this engineering thing is so key,
Mhm.
because usually every project ends up becoming its own engineering project. This, I think we're really figuring out, both on the IRC and the IBC, how to do minimally reinforced structural masonry buildings anywhere in the country, minus, maybe California or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think there is going to be a bit of a playbook at the end of this. And then if we can do videos, and, people still have to be motivated, because it's always hard. People, like, everyone wants to do it, but when they realize it's like hard, they're like, oh, never mind. So you still have to be really motivated. But if you are a motivated person and you're willing to like try your hand at some stuff, I think we're going to have information that really could teach people. And hopefully we can have workshops one day. We're inviting people down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why not? I mean, you're learning a real skill, which has value regardless of, this project or that project. You create some beauty in the world. You make some money doing it. It's not such a bad deal for a lot
Right.
of people.
Right.
Are there one of the in the weeds just questions that comes to mind? Obviously, the energy code things are issues. What are there other areas of building codes or other codes you ran across that really have been problematic especially when doing these in an in-town location?
Man. And I unfortunately, like, I don't remember enough the details to say all the specifics on some of these things, but fire and ADA
Hmm.
have been nightmarish.
Hmm.
And I'm really frustrated by it, because I have accessibility issues because of an accident, and I'm getting better at walking, but like I'm not in like a wheelchair or anything like that. But
Hmm.
I care about accessibility, so I'm not trying to be like, we
Yeah.
don't need accessibility. We do need accessibility. We need accessibility within reason. And then of course, I don't want a building to burn down any more than
Yeah.
anyone else, especially one of my own.
Hmm.
And some of these rules and regulations have just gotten absolutely unhelpful, and just kind of like silly.
Hmm.
And so we've had to work through a lot of that, and that's just been a lot of headaches, a lot of time, a lot of money's gone into it, and even design changes too. So those are a couple big ones. The elevator codes really just drive me crazy. That we have
Yeah.
specific elevator codes in the U.S. and Canada that's different than the rest of the world. You're basically and there would be a lot more elevators if we didn't have such stupid rules about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have often city and state requirements for elevators, which is kind of wild. But,
It really is. And then I recently learned about how the ICC is like how that functions, and they're not a governmental entity. They're a nonprofit.
right.
And I had this guy on the podcast, and we'll be publishing it soon, but like how the rules in the building world are made is pretty disheartening.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's
I'm not sure I would say it's corrupt, but it's not corrupt.
Yeah, I
you know,
mean, it's like anything else that is often not very transparent or accessible. That
right.
if you're an insider, you can make some changes and get things done. And especially if you're an industry, like for example HVAC, you can get all sorts of changes done that don't necessarily make for better buildings, but make for more expensive HVAC.
Right.
So
And that's part of the problem. Like started off a little bit like the it's like I want there to be experts out there, but the problem is when an expert is so narrow in their view and
mhm,
perspective, it's actually can be really counterproductive and
yeah,
harmful to the overall conversation, because what we really need is a conversation kind of from a high level vision level. And this goes from building codes to local zoning codes or whatever. Is like, what what are the goals? What does success look like? What does winning look like? In our, like, if we
yeah,
what are we trying to accomplish, and then trying to balance all the different things to achieve that. But instead it's just like fire person advocates for their thing,
yeah,
elevator advocates for their thing, electrical. And then as kind of like as a rulemaking body, like no one wants to argue with the expert, because like,
right,
well, they're the expert, so how can we argue with the expert?
yeah.
And something needs to change there.
Yeah, and you sure as hell can't go into a public hearing and argue against the fire chief
Oh
because
my gosh.
you're going to
Yeah.
lose every
And
time.
yeah, city councils, and I get it, like they're not experts in any of this stuff, so they don't
Right.
want to like put their neck on the line to do something that all these experts are telling them not to do.
Yeah,
So it's a
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
it's a lot of problems, hairy problems.
It's interesting because that so much of that is the genesis of the new urbanism. That's like a lot of what we talked about, and this is now going on over 30, 35 years. This the whole specialization of everything, and we used to talk ad nauseum about the benefits of being a generalist instead of a specialist. And once you can do that, once you can actually be a generalist and understand like what the big picture is and what you're trying to accomplish, you can really manipulate the specialties to get towards that goal. But there's just so very few people who can think that way. And so you're right. It just becomes, you've got your traffic engineer, your civil engineer, your planner, all the different aspects of anybody who touches the built environment, and they just think about their thing, and and then we just kind of lose whatever it is we're trying to accomplish out of it all. Um,
Yeah, we do. And
but that's my soapbox. So,
no,
uh,
it's a good
uh,
soapbox.
what is on the horizon for you as you think beyond the project that has you completely occupied
Right.
right now? Do you think about like the next 5-10 years, like where you want to go with this?
It's interesting. My vision for building culture has kind of grown every year just because of like what's in front of me. Just opportunities and stuff. And with this project and really learning the development side and getting stuff through entitlements and learning how to syndicate and raise funds and manage all of that. Um, I think ultimately I would really like to put together and this isn't going to be next, year or something, because I need to do multiple syndications kind of like as a proof of concept, but to put together a fund
Hmm.
that funds these really great infill projects and holds them long term. And eventually, it would be awesome to not just fund our own projects, but other people doing great projects. I actually think there's a lot of possibility there because I think there's a lot of money and interest. This is something I have been talking about a good bit lately, but nearly $500 billion is given away annually in the US to 501c3s.
Mm.
And I say 501c3s, just nonprofits.
Yeah.
So $500 billion annually in the US alone, not only not expecting a return, not even expecting their principal back. And then on the other side of that, you've got just maximize the ROI.
Hmm.
And so I've been thinking about like, we've got missing middle housing, we've got missing middle capital. Like there is an absolutely in between thing in business. You don't have to say I got to make it the maximum amount over here and then so that I can give money away over here. I think there's a large population. Well, it might be fairly small in term, but like I think there's enough that's probably got billions of dollars of people that are saying, I want to protect my wealth generationally. I want to grow it. I want to do good in the community while I'm doing, especially if I live there.
Hmm.
And I want to see these things happen. And I don't need to hit a 20% IRR. I just want to protect my principal, get return, and over the long haul, really build real wealth
Yeah.
that can be passed down. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and that's kind of where I come with the fund, where it can have some more flexibility than just a syndication, where it's here's the fund, here's the types of projects we're doing, and here's the types of metrics we're looking at, and then we get to go do things.
Yeah.
Because the main thing holding me back now is capital, and I think a lot of probably new urbanists too.
Yeah. I I mean, I like the way you described that as like the missing middle in finance, because there is this huge gap between sort of the local community bank where you do a small project or just one business or whatever, and then the Wall Street, real estate investment trust, or VC funds or something like that that have hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Um,
And they will never invest in this stuff
no, never. Yeah.
because, like, never, because they're investing pension funds and endowments, and they don't want they want like multifamily is a new asset class for them to be investing
Yeah.
into,
Yeah.
and that's actually pretty recent. And so this stuff is really high net worth individuals and family offices that could be interested. And that's that high net worth individual, which is just, I mean, that's a technical definition of, people, accredited investors, people
Right.
worth over $1 million of net assets, excluding their primary residence, or making 200,000 a year as a single or 300,000 as a married. There's a lot of people that fit in that category. And a lot of those people have never invested in real estate because there's not been a mechanism to do so unless you're
Sure.
going to go put it in a REIT or something like that. But like to be able to say like, hi, Todd, who's in my neighborhood, who's a real estate investor, like they're putting together a project. Now, granted, you got to be careful because
Yeah.
people can lose money. This is real serious stuff and real risks. But I just think there's some real opportunity here.
Yeah. No doubt. No doubt. I mean, Chris Lineberger, who is at Brookings now and used to be a developer in Albuquerque and other places, I think, but he used to describe the Wall Street model as they have 19 standard product types.
Yeah.
And you could literally describe each product type to a T for, from all the built and financial criteria. And that's why we see so much of the same stuff all over the country, because the large investment pool is really just looking for widgets that
Yep.
fit one of those types. And that's what they finance, because that's what they know. That's what they know how to finance. And they're looking for scale when they do it. Um,
This is kind of an interesting on that note. I was recently at a workshop, because I'm trying to like learn more about capital raising and
uh,
management and all that. And it was about institutional money. It was like what I took away was like, wow, I will never raise institutional money. But part of their point was literally, they're like, if you're raising from institutional money, don't put any pretty pictures on there. Don't design your slides. Don't be aspirational at all. Like that will literally turn them off. Like have the text running off the page. Just like
yeah.
make it, just make it about these things and the details. Like they do not care what it is. They do not care what it looks like. And I've been thinking about that. And it's like it's really that idea of faceless money. And
Yeah.
once something's faceless and you're managing on someone else's behalf and costs are rising, so they're trying to squeeze out more and more profit for that pension fund or that endowment. Um, that's kind of inherently what happens. And so what I would like to see, I guess I don't have another term for this yet, but is like uh known money, or I don't know what it is. Like instead of faceless money, it's like known money. When you actually know what you're doing and what you're investing in and what you're building, or whether it's a company or you're building real estate, like I think we need more of that rather than just like handing off money to institutions. And it's interesting because a lot of people will blame capitalism for what the world looks like today in the US. And I don't know where you stand on this
Mhm.
per se, but I mean, and I mean there's greed out there, there's developers that I'm like, man, they're just totally, that's true. But the regulations and the incentives and the codes and all that have pushed a lot of this stuff, for one. And then secondly, on the financial side with institutional money and all that, like a lot of that literally is coming from pension funds.
Yeah.
And realizing like, oh, that's interesting, it's actually not really people's like personal capital that they're
Right.
investing, like the true like capitalism part. This is like some retirement plan and things, these giant bloated things that are kind of like building all of this stuff to squeak out more profit, because it's not at the individual level, it's not at the community level. And I don't know, just something I've been thinking about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could probably crack open a couple of beers and go down that rabbit hole a long time. It's fascinating because, the way I like to think about it is like every beautiful place in this country that we admire was built with ruthless capitalism, for the most part. But it was very different. It was like you said, it was almost entirely locally financed and built, and there just wasn't, it wasn't built by Wall Street, and it's a very different model of how we used to build all of our communities and places, and we still admire those buildings today and those communities, and enjoy them tremendously. But it was a different kind of market economy than the economy we have now. So
I completely agree.
yeah. I will put just a plug in. I don't know if you listened to this episode, but for others, the not too long ago, I had the guys on from Hiatus Homes in Bend, Oregon, and they actually did set up an investment fund funded by local people in Bend who wanted to invest in their projects.
Well,
And it's a really cool story. It's really worth listening to as an example of a very locally driven investment fund for projects, for good projects. So
amazing. What
worth
episode is
listening.
that?
It Hiatus Homes is
Hiatus
their
Homes.
company, and I'd say it must have been probably about a month or two ago. I'm already losing track.
Yeah,
Good
I'll
guys.
definitely have to check that out.
Yeah. Well, Austin, we're running over an hour here. This has been a lot of fun, and I'd love to keep talking, but I probably should let you go here at some point. How, what is the best way that you would like for people to find you and see what all you're up to?
If you want to follow me personally, I'm mainly on X right now at Austin Tennell. That's probably where I'm like posting my actual thoughts,
Hmm.
or my newsletter or my podcast. So Building Culture Podcast, or playbook.buildingculture.com for the newsletter. And then of course Instagram for our kind of main building culture account if you want to see pretty pictures of buildings and
Yeah.
things.
Well,
So
who doesn't want to see pretty pictures of buildings?
yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, and Kevin, we'll have to swap here sometime where I have you on and get to talk to you and interview you. So
Oh,
we'll
that'd
set
be
that up.
yeah. We'll have to talk about something totally different though. So
Okay.
this is great, Austin. Really appreciate your time and everything that you're doing, and love to follow you and your team. And you're really not that. I always say to all of my friends in Oklahoma, you're not that far away. We should all like get together and have a big party one of these
We
days.
really should. I mean, really. So yeah, let's make it happen.
All right, thanks. Take care.
Thanks, Kevin.